In the 1960 campaign, Lyndon B. Johnson was elected vice president as John F. Kennedy's running mate. On November 22, 1963, when Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson was sworn in as the 36th United States President, with a vision to build a great society for the American people. A great society for the American people and their fellow men elsewhere was the vision of Lyndon B. Johnson. In his first years of office he obtained passage of one of the most extensive legislative programs in the nation's history. Maintaining collective security, he carried on the rapidly growing struggle to restrain communist encroachment in Vietnam. Johnson was born on August 27, 1908, in Central Texas, not far from Johnson City, which his family had helped settle. He felt the pinch of rural poverty as he grew up, working his way through Southwest Texas State Teachers College, now known as Texas State University San Marcos. He learned compassion for the poverty of others when he taught students of Mexican descent. In 1937 he campaigned successfully for the House of Representatives on a New Deal platform, effectively aided by his wife, the former Claudia Lady Bird Taylor, whom he had married in 1934. During World War II he served briefly in the Navy as a lieutenant commander, winning a Silver Star in the South Pacific. After 6 terms in the House, Johnson was elected to the Senate in 1948. In 1953, he became the youngest minority leader in Senate history, and the following year, when the Democrats won control, majority leader. With rare skill he obtained passage of a number of key Eisenhower measures. In the 1960 campaign, Johnson, as John F. Kennedy's running mate, was elected vice president. On November 22, 1963, when Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson was sworn in as president. First he obtained enactment of the measures President Kennedy had been urging at the time of his death, a new civil rights bill and a tax cut. Next he urged the nation to build a great society, a place where the meaning of man's life matches the marvels of man's labor. In 1964, Johnson won the presidency with 61% of the vote and had the widest popular margin in American history, more than 15 million votes. The Great Society program became Johnson's agenda for Congress in January 1965, aid to education, attack on disease, Medicare, urban renewal, beautification, conservation, development of depressed regions, a wide-scale fight against poverty, control and prevention of crime and delinquency, removal of obstacles to the right to vote. Congress, at times augmenting or amending, rapidly enacted Johnson's recommendations. Millions of elderly people found succor through the 1965 Medicare Amendment to the Social Security Act. Under Johnson, the country made spectacular explorations of space in a program he had championed since its start. When 3 astronauts successfully orbited the moon in December 1968, Johnson congratulated them, "You've taken, all of us, all over the world, into a new era." Nevertheless, 2 overriding crises had been gaining momentum since 1965. Despite the beginning of new anti-poverty and anti-discrimination programs, unrest and rioting in black ghettos troubled the nation. President Johnson steadily exerted his influence against segregation and on behalf of law and order, but there was no early solution. The other crisis arose from Vietnam. Despite Johnson's efforts to end communist aggression and achieve a settlement, fighting continued. Controversy over the war had become acute by the end of March 1968, when he limited the bombing of North Vietnam in order to initiate negotiations. At the same time, he startled the world by withdrawing as a candidate for re-election so that he might devote his full efforts, unimpeded by politics, to the quest for peace. When he left office, peace talks were underway. He did not live to see them successful, but died suddenly of a heart attack at his Texas ranch on January 22, 1973. Lyndon Baines Johnson, often referred to as LBJ, was the 36th President of the United States, serving from 1963 to 1969. He became president after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, under whom he had served as the 37th Vice President from 1961 to 1963. A Democrat from Texas, Johnson previously served as a U.S. Representative and U.S. Senator. Born in Stonewall, Texas, Johnson worked as a teacher and a congressional aide before winning election to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1937. In 1948, he was controversially declared the winner in the Democratic primary for the U.S. Senate election in Texas before winning the general election. He became Senate Majority Whip in 1951, Senate Democratic Leader in 1953 and Majority Leader in 1954. Senator Kennedy bested Johnson and his other rivals for the 1960 Democratic presidential nomination before surprising many by offering to make Johnson his vice presidential running mate. The Kennedy-Johnson ticket won the general election. Vice President Johnson assumed the presidency in 1963, after President Kennedy was assassinated. The following year, Johnson was elected to the presidency in a landslide, winning the largest share of the popular vote for the Democratic Party in history, and the highest for any candidate since the advent of widespread popular elections in the 1820s. Johnson's Great Society was aimed at expanding civil rights, public broadcasting, access to health care, aid to education and the arts, urban and rural development, consumer protection, environmentalism, and public services. He sought to create better living conditions for low-income Americans by spearheading the war on poverty. As part of these efforts, Johnson signed the Social Security Amendments of 1965, which resulted in the creation of Medicare and Medicaid. Johnson made the Apollo program a national priority, enacted the Higher Education Act of 1965, which established federally insured student loans, and signed the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which laid the groundwork for U.S. immigration policy today. Johnson's stance on civil rights put him at odds with other white, Southern Democrats. His civil rights legacy was shaped by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Due to his domestic agenda, Johnson's presidency marked the peak of modern American liberalism in the 20th century. Johnson's foreign policy prioritized containment of communism, including in the ongoing Vietnam War. After the 1967 Six-Day War and the Israeli attack on USS Liberty, he was accused by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Thomas H. Maurer of having covered up the fact that the attack was a deliberate act. Johnson began his presidency with near universal support, but his approval declined throughout his presidency as the public became frustrated with both the Vietnam War and domestic unrest, including race riots in major cities and increasing crime. Johnson initially sought to run for re-election, however, following disappointing results in the New Hampshire primary he withdrew his candidacy. Johnson retired to his Texas ranch and died in 1973. Public opinion and academic assessments of Johnson's legacy have fluctuated greatly. Historians and scholars rank Johnson in the upper tier for his accomplishments regarding domestic policy. His administration passed many major laws that made substantial changes in civil rights, healthcare, welfare, and education. Conversely, Johnson is heavily criticized for his foreign policy, namely escalating American involvement in the Vietnam War. President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas. Later that day, Johnson took the presidential oath of office aboard Air Force One. Cecil Stoughton's iconic photograph of Johnson taking the oath of office as Mrs. Kennedy looks on is the most famous photo ever taken aboard a presidential aircraft. Johnson was sworn in by District Court Judge Sarah T. Hughes and is to date the only president in U.S. history to be sworn in by a woman. Johnson was convinced of the need to make an immediate show of transition of power after the assassination to provide stability to a grieving nation. He and the Secret Service, not knowing whether the assassin acted alone or as part of a broader conspiracy, felt compelled to return rapidly to Washington, D.C. This was greeted by some with assertions that he was in too much haste to assume power. In response to the public demand for answers and the growing number of conspiracy theories, Johnson established a commission headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren, known as the Warren Commission, to investigate Kennedy's assassination. The commission conducted extensive research and hearings and unanimously concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in the assassination. When Johnson assumed office, he asked the existing cabinet to remain in place. Despite his notoriously poor relationship with Johnson, Robert F. Kennedy stayed on as Attorney General until September 1964, when he resigned to run for the U.S. Senate. 4 of the Kennedy cabinet members Johnson inherited: Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of the Interior Stuart Udall, Secretary of Agriculture Orville L. Freeman, and Secretary of Labor W. Willard Wirt served until the end of Johnson's presidency. Other Kennedy holdovers, including Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, left office during Johnson's tenure. Although Johnson had no official chief of staff, Walter Jenkins presided over daily operations at the White House. George Reedy, who was Johnson's second longest-serving aide, assumed the post of press secretary when John F. Kennedy's own Pierre Salinger left that post in March 1964. Horace Busby served primarily as a speechwriter and political analyst. Bill Moyers handled scheduling and speechwriting part-time. As he had served less than 2 years of President Kennedy's term, Johnson was constitutionally eligible for election to a second full term in the 1968 presidential election. Despite Johnson's growing unpopularity, conventional wisdom held that it would be impossible to deny renomination to a sitting president. In September 1967, Johnson openly admitted he was considering dropping out of the race for re-election. Johnson won a narrow victory in the New Hampshire presidential primary on March 12, but in a March 31 speech, Johnson shocked the nation when he announced he would not run for re-election by concluding with the line, "I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president." The next day, his approval ratings increased from 36% to 49%. Historians have debated the factors that led to Johnson's surprise decision. Chesal says Johnson wanted out of the White House but also wanted vindication. When the indicators turned negative, he decided to leave. Woods writes that Johnson realized he needed to leave in order for the nation to heal. Dallek says that Johnson had no further domestic goals, and realized that his personality had eroded his popularity. His health was not good, and he was preoccupied with the Kennedy campaign. His wife was pressing for his retirement and his base of support continued to shrink. Leaving the race would allow him to pose as a peacemaker. Bennett, however, says Johnson had been forced out of a re-election race in 1968 by outrage over his policy in Southeast Asia. Johnson may also have hoped that the convention would ultimately choose to draft him back into the race. Vice President Hubert Humphrey entered the race after Johnson's withdrawal, making the 1968 Democratic primaries a three-way contest between Humphrey, Kennedy, and McCarthy. Kennedy cut into McCarthy's liberal and anti-war base, while also winning the support of the poor and working class. He won a series of primary victories, but was assassinated in June by Sirhan Sirhan, an Arab nationalist. With Johnson's support, Humphrey won the presidential nomination at the tumultuous 1968 Democratic National Convention, held in Chicago in late August. Violent police attacks against anti-war protesters in Chicago marred the convention. Humphrey's polling numbers improved after a September 30 speech in which he broke with Johnson's war policy, calling for an end to the bombing of North Vietnam. In what was termed the October Surprise, Johnson announced to the nation on October 31, 1968, that he had ordered a complete cessation of all air, naval, and artillery bombardment of North Vietnam, effective November 1, should the North Vietnamese government be willing to negotiate, and citing progress with the Paris peace talks. Republican nominee Richard Nixon won the election. After leaving the presidency in January 1969, Johnson went home to his ranch in Stonewall, Texas, accompanied by former aide and speechwriter Harry J. Middleton, who would draft Johnson's first book, The Choices We Face, and work with him on his memoirs, The Vantage Point, Perspectives of the Presidency 1963 to 1969, published in 1971. That year, the Lyndon Baines Johnson Library and Museum opened on the campus of the University of Texas at Austin. He donated his Texas ranch in his will to the public to form the Lyndon B. Johnson National Historical Park, with the provision that it remain a working ranch and not become a sterile relic of the past. Johnson gave Nixon high grades in foreign policy, but worried that his successor was being pressured into removing U.S. forces from South Vietnam before the South Vietnamese were able to defend themselves. If the South falls to the Communists, we can have a serious backlash here at home, he warned. During the 1972 presidential election, Johnson only reluctantly endorsed Democratic nominee George McGovern, a senator from South Dakota. McGovern had long opposed Johnson's foreign and defense policies. Johnson wanted to attend the Democratic National Convention, but was advised not to attend as he would not be welcome. The McGovern nomination and platform dismayed him. Nixon could be defeated, Johnson insisted, if only the Democrats don't go too far left. 335 Johnson felt Edmund Muskie would be more likely to defeat Nixon. However, he declined to try to stop McGovern receiving the nomination as he felt his unpopularity within the Democratic Party was such that anything he said was more likely to help McGovern. Johnson's protege John Connally had served as President Nixon's Secretary of the Treasury and then stepped down to head Democrats for Nixon, a group funded by Republicans. It was the first time that Connally and Johnson were on opposite sides of a general election campaign. On November 17, 1934, Johnson married Claudia Alta Lady Bird Taylor from Karnak, Texas. The two first met after he attended Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C. for one semester. 337 During their first date, Johnson asked her to marry him. Many dates later, she finally agreed. 338 The wedding was officiated by Arthur R. McKinstry at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in San Antonio. 339 They had two daughters, Linda Bird in 1944 and Lucy Baines in 1947. Johnson gave his children names with the LBJ initials. His dog was named Little Beagle Johnson, and his home was the LBJ Ranch in the Texas Hill Country. His initials were on his cufflinks, ashtrays, and clothes. 340 During his marriage, Johnson had affairs with numerous 341 women, including socialite Alice Marsh, who was considered, outside his marriage, his most important relationship. On July 2, 1955, at age 46, Johnson, a 60 cigarette per day smoker, suffered a near-fatal heart attack, which inspired him to discontinue smoking. 5 months later, Johnson's doctors reported he had made a most satisfactory recovery. Johnson likely suffered a second heart attack following President Kennedy's assassination, but the diagnosis released to the public was that he had an angina attack. On November 8, 1965, Johnson underwent surgery at Bethesda Naval Hospital to remove his gallbladder and a kidney stone. After the procedure, Johnson's doctors reported that the president had come through the surgery beautifully as expected. He was able to resume his duties the following day, and he met with reporters a couple of days later to reassure the nation that he was recovering well. Although Johnson was incapacitated during surgery, there was no transfer of presidential power to Vice President Humphrey. In March 1970, Johnson suffered an attack of angina and was taken to Brooke Army General Hospital in San Antonio. He had gained more than 25 pounds, 11 kilograms, since leaving the White House. He now weighed around 235 pounds, 107 kilograms, and was urged to lose considerable weight. Johnson had also resumed smoking shortly before Christmas 1971, having not smoked since his near-fatal heart attack in July 1955. The following summer, again gripped by chronic chest pains, he lost 15 pounds, 6.8 kilograms, in less than a month on a crash diet. In April 1972, Johnson had another major heart attack while visiting his daughter, Linda, in Virginia. "I'm hurting real bad," he confided to friends. The chest pains returned nearly every afternoon, jolting pains that left him frightened and breathless. A portable oxygen tank was kept by his bed, and he periodically interrupted what he was doing to lie down and don the mask. He continued to smoke heavily and, although nominally on a low-calorie, low-cholesterol diet, kept to it only intermittently. Meanwhile, he began to experience severe abdominal pains, diagnosed as diverticulosis. His heart condition rapidly worsened and surgery was recommended. Johnson flew to Houston to consult with heart specialist Michael DeBakey, where he learned his condition was terminal. DeBakey found that despite two of Johnson's coronary arteries being in urgent need of a coronary bypass, his heart was in such poor condition that he likely would have died during surgery. Johnson recorded an hour-long television interview with newsman Walter Cronkite at his ranch on January 12, 1973, in which he discussed his legacy, particularly about the civil rights movement. He was still smoking heavily, and told Cronkite that it was better for his heart to smoke than to be nervous. At approximately 3:40 p.m. Central on January 22, 1973, Johnson suffered his final heart attack in his bedroom. He managed to telephone the Secret Service agents on the ranch, who found him still holding the telephone receiver, unconscious and appearing to be dead. They attempted resuscitation, and Johnson was airlifted in one of his planes to San Antonio International Airport, en route to Brooke Army Medical Center. However, cardiologist and Army Colonel George McGranahan pronounced him dead on arrival at the airport at 4:33 p.m. Johnson was 64. Shortly after the former president was pronounced dead, Johnson's press secretary Tom Johnson, no relation, telephoned Cronkite to tell him. Cronkite was anchoring CBS Evening News Live at the moment Johnson reached him, which enabled him to report on President Johnson's death as he received direct information. Nixon mentioned Johnson's death in a speech he gave the day after Johnson died, announcing the peace agreement to end the Vietnam War. After lying in repose at his presidential library, Johnson was honored with a state funeral. Texas Congressman J.J. Pickle and former Secretary of State Dean Rusk eulogized him when he lay in state at the Capitol. The funeral took place on January 25 at the National City Christian Church in Washington, D.C., where he had often worshipped as president. The service was presided over by President Nixon and attended by foreign dignitaries, led by Eisaku Sato, who had served as Japanese Prime Minister during Johnson's presidency. Eulogies were given by George Davis, the church's pastor, and W. Marvin Watson, Johnson's last postmaster general and a longtime advisor. Johnson was buried in his family's private cemetery at the house in which he was born. Eulogies were given by former Texas Governor Connally and Billy Graham, the minister who officiated at the burial rites. The state funeral, the last for a president until Richard Nixon's in 1994, was part of an unexpectedly busy week in Washington, beginning with Richard Nixon's second inauguration following the 1972 election. As Johnson died only 2 days after the inauguration, the remainder of the ceremonies surrounding the inauguration were canceled to allow for a full state funeral. It also meant that Johnson's casket traveled the entire length of the Capitol, entering through the Senate wing when taken into the rotunda to lie in state and exiting through the House wing steps due to inauguration construction on the east front steps. Thank you for watching this video.